Carol Burnett, my real name. No, actually, it isn't. There was some other performer that has my real name, so I had to change it. My real name is Ben Gazzara.
We all know Carol Burnett as Hollywood's undisputed queen of clean comedy and warm, ear-tugging charm. But beneath that legendary smile lies a woman who strictly refused to be pushed around. Behind the sparkling dresses and iconic ear tugs were moments of explosive backstage tension, venomous public betrayals, and furious confrontations with huge industry stars. Today, we are digging into 5 times Carol Burnett proved she wasn't just sweet. She was someone you absolutely did not want on your bad side. How does this feel for the opening beat? Ready to move on to the Elvis section next? Elvis Presley and the hostile crowd. When you think about the biggest stars of the 20th century, Carol Burnett and Elvis Presley occupy 2 completely different universes. Carol was the queen of televised variety, a master of physical comedy, broad character work, and musical theater polish. Elvis was the king of rock and roll, a cultural earthquake in blue suede shoes who set off moral panics everywhere he went. You would never expect their paths to cross in a way that resulted in total humiliation. But early in Carol's career, the King of Rock accidentally set the stage for the single most hostile performance of her life. It became a moment where Carol felt genuine hatred, not toward Elvis as a human being, but toward an arena full of hysterically cruel audience members who treated her like garbage just for existing on the same stage as their idol. The year was 1956. Carol Burnett was not yet a household name. She was a hungry, hard-working performer trying to make a dent in New York City. She managed to book an appearance on The Stage Show, a popular variety program hosted by big band leaders Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey. For a young artist trying to pay rent, getting a national television slot was like winning the lottery. But there was a massive catch that nobody warned her about. The producers had booked her on the exact same broadcast as a rising 21-year-old sensation from Mississippi named Elvis Presley. At this point, in 1956, Elvis mania was exploding across America. Teenagers were whipped into an absolute frenzy by his music, his hips, and his rebellious image. Outside the studio, thousands of frantic fans packed the streets. Inside the auditorium, the energy was downright volatile. The seats were packed edge to edge with teenage girls who had waited hours in the cold just to catch a glimpse of Elvis. They did not care about big band music. They did not care about standard variety acts. And they certainly did not care about a young female comedian doing character bits. They wanted Elvis, and they wanted him immediately. The show's producers made a catastrophic scheduling decision. Instead of placing Carol's comedy routine early in the broadcast to warm up the crowd, they slated her to perform in the high-pressure slot directly preceding Elvis. The stage manager pushed Carol out under the blinding studio lights. The moment she walked out, she could feel the wave of pure animosity washing over the footlights. The audience did not cheer. They groaned. They realized that this tall, lanky woman in a dress was standing between them and the man of their dreams. Carol launched into her carefully rehearsed comedy set, but before she could even hit her first punchline, the crowd revolted. Screams echoed through the auditorium. "We want Elvis, and get off the stage!" People started booing. Every time Carol tried to speak, her voice was drowned out by a wall of deafening, aggressive noise. It wasn't just a tough room. It was a wall of pure, unadulterated hatred aimed directly at her face. For any performer, standing alone on a lit stage while hundreds of people scream at you to get lost is the ultimate nightmare. Carol had 2 choices: run off the stage in tears or stand her ground and finish her set. Showing the iron spine that would later define her entire career, she refused to give them the satisfaction of breaking her. She pushed through the noise, delivering every single joke into a wall of boos and shrieks, forcing herself to finish every line of her material despite the overwhelming hostility in the room. When the red light on the camera finally turned off, Carol walked off stage into the wings, completely shaken, humiliated, and furious. She hated the way she had been treated, and she hated the realization that a mob of hysterical fans could completely strip away a performer's dignity in a matter of seconds. But then came the twist that changed her perspective on the entire nightmare. Backstage, sitting in his dressing room, was Elvis himself. Elvis was well aware of the madness taking place outside his door. He had heard the crowd's cruel reaction to Carol's set. As Carol was collecting her things, feeling completely humiliated and ready to quit show business, Elvis approached her. He was soft-spoken, incredibly polite, and deeply apologetic about how his fans had behaved. He told her that she was hilarious and that she didn't deserve any of that disrespect. To prove his sincerity and offer a small peace offering, he signed an autograph for Carol's younger sister, Chrissy, who was a massive fan. Elvis proved to be a total gentleman, transforming what could have been a bitter core memory into a valuable lesson about the brutality of live show business. Carol walked away from that night hating the mob mentality of the crowd, but respecting the man at the center of the storm. She learned that no matter how hostile an audience gets, you never abandon the stage, a lesson that served her well when she eventually had to take control of her own set years later. So how do you bounce back from getting humiliated in front of Elvis? You run your own show until your co-star starts acting like a diva. Harvey Corman and The Dressing Room Firing. By the early 70s, Carol Burnett was no longer the struggling young comedian being drowned out by a room full of screaming teenagers. She was the undisputed monarch of American television, hosting The Carol Burnett Show on CBS. The variety series was a juggernaut of ratings, sweeping the Emmys year after year. Central to the show's massive success was the electrifying chemistry between Carol and her primary co-star, Harvey Corman. Corman was a brilliant comic actor, a master of physical comedy, and the perfect comedic foil to Burnett's wild character work. Together, they made millions of people laugh every single week. But behind the laughter and the sparkling costumes, a quiet poison was brewing on the soundstage during the show's 7th season. Corman developed a severe attitude problem that escalated into outright backstage hostility, and Carol was forced to show him that she hated divine behavior far more than she valued star power. As The Carol Burnett Show rolled into its 7th year, the grind of production began to take a heavy toll on the cast and crew. Harvey Corman, while undeniably talented, was a complex and often moody individual who struggled with intense self-doubt and perfectionism. Under the pressure of a weekly live-to-tape broadcast, those insecurities morphed into toxic behavior. Corman began throwing temper tantrums during rehearsals, complaining openly about scripts, and acting completely dismissive toward the production staff. But the breaking point didn't come from how he treated the director or the writers. It came from how he began treating the show's guest stars. The Carol Burnett Show was famous for attracting top-tier talent from across the entertainment world, from pop icons to acting legends. Guests came on the show expecting a fun, collaborative environment, only to be met with Corman's sharp tongue and icy demeanor. During one particularly tense rehearsal week, global music superstar Petula Clark was guest starring. Corman was reportedly rude, impatient, and openly dismissive toward her during run-throughs. Soon after, comedy master Tim Conway, who was not yet a permanent cast member, but a frequent guest, was subjected to Corman's moody, antagonistic behavior during sketch preparations. For Carol Burnett, this was an absolute violation of her core principles. Burnett had built her entire production around the concept of family, mutual respect, and warmth. She firmly believed that no matter how famous you were, you treated everyone on set, from the stagehands to the guest stars, with decency and professionalism. Watching one of her closest creative partners behave like an arrogant diva filled her with a mixture of profound disappointment and white-hot anger. She hated the toxic atmosphere Corman was creating, and she knew that if she let it slide, the spirit of her show would be permanently ruined. Carol decided she was not going to let anyone destroy the culture she had worked so hard to build. Rather than sending a producer or a network suit to handle the problem, she took matters into her own hands. During a break in rehearsals, she marched directly down the hallway to Harvey Corman's dressing room. She knocked on the door, walked inside, and shut it firmly behind her. Without raised voices or dramatic hysterics, Carol confronted Corman directly. She told him point-blank that his attitude was unacceptable, that he was hurting people's feelings, and that his toxic behavior toward guests like Petula Clark and Tim Conway had to stop immediately. Corman, caught off guard and defensive, made a catastrophic mistake. Instead of apologizing or de-escalating the situation, he snapped back at her. He made a dismissive comment, telling Carol that she needed to stay out of his business and mind her own affairs. That was the line in the sand. Carol did not yell, cry, or engage in a shouting match. Instead, she looked him dead in the eye, walked over to his dressing room phone, picked up the receiver, and dialed his agent's phone number right in front of him. When the agent answered, Carol spoke clearly and calmly. "I'm standing here with Harvey, and I'm calling to tell you that he is officially fired from the show. We are writing him out as of today." Corman froze in utter shock. He had assumed that because he was crucial to the show's success, Carol would never actually pull the trigger. He realized in an instant that he had completely miscalculated her resolve. Panic set in immediately. Seeing that she was completely serious and that his lucrative, award-winning career move was about to evaporate into thin air, Corman broke down. He begged her to put the phone down and give him one more chance. He admitted that he had been acting like an absolute fool, apologized profusely for his behavior, and swore on his life that he would change his attitude immediately. Carol looked at her terrified, humbled co-star and agreed to give him one final opportunity. She ended the call with his agent, made Corman promise to apologize to the guest stars and the crew, and walked out of the room. The strategy worked like a charm. Corman took the lesson to heart, completely overhauled his demeanor, and became a model of professionalism and kindness for the remainder of his time on the show. He and Carol repaired their relationship, moving past the intense friction to remain lifelong, deeply devoted friends until his death in 2008. But that intense dressing room showdown proved to everyone in Hollywood that under Carol's sweet exterior was a powerhouse boss who hated disrespect and was never afraid to swing the axe. Harvey Corman learned his lesson the hard way. But what happens when the attack doesn't come from backstage, but directly from the press? The National Enquirer and the defamation war. By 1976, Carol Burnett was widely recognized as one of the most beloved figures in American pop culture. A clean-cut, wholesome entertainer whose reputation was entirely untarnished. But in March of that year, she picked up a copy of the National Enquirer and read a paragraph that ignited a pure, burning hatred, unlike anything she had experienced before. The tabloid printed a fabricated gossip item alleging that Burnett had engaged in a loud, boisterous, drunken spectacle with diplomat Henry Kissinger at a high-end restaurant in Washington, D.C. The story claimed she accidentally knocked over a tray of glasses, spilled wine everywhere, and offered Kissinger a bite of her dessert in a sloppy, disruptive scene that mortified the other diners. To the average celebrity, a ridiculous tabloid rumor might be written off as the unfortunate cost of fame. But to Carol Burnett, this specific lie hit her like a personal missile. The source of her intense anger was deeply personal and painfully tragic. Burnett had been raised in poverty by parents who both suffered from severe destructive alcoholism, a disease that eventually cut their lives short. Having watched her family be torn apart by alcohol abuse, Burnett made a conscious, lifelong decision to maintain a clean public image and drink responsibly. Seeing her name plastered across millions of supermarket checkouts as a loud, out-of-control drunk wasn't just inaccurate. It felt like a malicious attack on her core identity and a deep insult to her family's painful history. Burnett immediately demanded a full retraction and apology from the tabloid. The National Enquirer issued a brief, tucked-away correction weeks later, but it lacked any genuine remorse and did nothing to fix the massive damage already done to her reputation. The executive editors assumed Burnett would simply back down, just as virtually every other Hollywood star had done before her. At the time, conventional wisdom in the entertainment industry dictated that celebrities should never sue tabloids. High-profile lawsuits were notoriously difficult to win due to strict legal standards regarding public figures, and the legal fees were astronomical. Most publicists advised their clients to ignore the lies and wait for the news cycle to blow over. Carol refused to stay quiet. Driven by a righteous fury and a deep hatred for predatory gossip journalism that profited off destroying innocent lives, she made the bold decision to take the National Enquirer straight to court. She hired top-tier legal representation and launched a high-stakes libel lawsuit, Burnett versus National Enquirer, determined to hold the publisher accountable for making up stories out of thin air. When the case finally went to trial in 1981, it became a massive national spectacle. Burnett personally took the witness stand, delivering emotional and fiery testimony. She explained to the jury why the fake story caused her so much anguish, recounting her parents' painful battles with alcoholism and detailing the shame she felt, knowing millions of readers believed she was following in their footsteps. Her legal team methodically, systematically dismantled the tabloid's defense, proving that the writer and editors had zero credible sources, conducted no serious fact-checking, and published the fabricated story with a total, reckless disregard for the truth. The trial culminated in a historic, groundbreaking victory for Burnett. The jury ruled overwhelmingly in her favor, initially awarding her $1.6 million in damages, which was later adjusted on appeal. It was the first time a major celebrity had successfully sued a tabloid for libel and won such a monumental judgment in a court of law. The landmark ruling sent shockwaves through the media industry, permanently altering how gossip rags operated and establishing a crucial precedent for celebrity privacy and journalistic accountability. Burnett didn't keep a single cent of the monetary settlement for herself. To prove that her lawsuit was motivated entirely by principle rather than greed, she donated the entire payout to journalism ethics programs at the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Hawaii. She wanted to ensure that future generations of reporters were trained to uphold truth and integrity, the exact values the tabloid had thrown away. Burnett's fiery stand demonstrated that she hated cruelty disguised as news, and she possessed the incredible courage needed to single-handedly rewrite the rules of Hollywood media. Winning in court proved Carol wasn't one to be pushed around, a lesson another comedy icon was about to learn the hard way. Joan Rivers and the late-night feud. In the male-dominated world of mid-20th century comedy, women had to stick together. For years, Carol Burnett and Joan Rivers shared a quiet, mutual respect as trailblazers who had kicked open doors for future generations of female performers. Carol ruled primetime television with her warm, musical, slapstick variety hour, while Joan built an empire on sharp, ruthless, observational stand-up comedy. They were two sides of the same coin, hilarious, fiercely hard-working women who had conquered an industry that constantly doubted them. But in the mid-'80s, that sisterhood shattered when Joan crossed a line that transformed Carol's professional admiration into deep personal resentment. Joan Rivers had built her career on being unfiltered and biting. Her signature catchphrase, "Can we talk?" was usually followed by a sharp jab at a celebrity's appearance, marriage, or personal misfortunes. For the most part, Hollywood stars accepted Joan's jokes as part of the business. But Joan's brand of comedy sometimes pushed far past poking fun at celebrity culture into deeply sensitive, painful personal territory. During one of her high-profile late-night television appearances, Joan turned her sights toward Carol Burnett's family. At the time, Carol was privately enduring every parent's absolute worst nightmare. Her teenage daughter, Carrie Hamilton, was fighting a very public, agonizing battle with severe addiction. Carol and Carrie were working tirelessly behind closed doors to get Carrie into treatment, navigate recovery, and save her life. It was a terrifying, delicate personal crisis that devastated Carol. Joan, always looking for the sharpest edge for her material, made a tasteless, mocking joke on national television about Carol's family situation and her daughter's struggles. For Carol, the joke was a devastating stab in the back. She didn't view it as harmless ribbing or standard late-night satire. She saw it as a cruel, exploitative attack on a child in crisis. Having built her career on bringing people together through joy, Carol hated the mean-spirited nature of targeting a family's real-life suffering for a cheap laugh. The fact that the insult came from a fellow female comedian, someone who knew how brutal the public eye could be, made the betrayal cut twice as deep. Rather than engaging in a messy, public shouting match in the press, Carol handled the situation with cold, decisive, boundary setting. When Joan Rivers launched her own late-night program, The Late Show starred Joan Rivers, in 1986, Joan's producers actively recruited top-tier Hollywood royalty to appear as guests. Because of Carol's immense prestige and popularity, getting her on the couch would have been a massive booking victory for the fledgling show. Carol flatly refused. She made it crystal clear to her team and network executives that she would never set foot on Joan's set, nor would she share a stage with someone who had weaponized her family's pain for television ratings. When asked about the rift during a candid appearance on The Tonight Show, Carol didn't throw a dramatic tantrum. Instead, she offered a poised, firm explanation. She publicly acknowledged that while she respected Joan's talent, Joan had crossed an unforgivable personal line. Burnett stated simply that true humor doesn't require kicking people when they are already down, and she refused to lend her star power to support a platform built on that kind of cruelty. The freeze between the two comedy titans lasted for years. Joan, known for her fierce stubbornness, initially brushed off the tension. But as time went on, the weight of alienating one of the most respected women in show business grew heavy. Eventually, as the years passed and Carol's daughter Carrie successfully achieved long-term sobriety and tragically passed away years later from cancer in 2002, the raw edges of the feud began to soften. Joan eventually made quiet attempts to reach out and express remorse for the hurt her jokes had caused. Recognizing that life was too short to hold on to bitter grudges indefinitely, Carol eventually allowed the ice to thaw. While they were never again close confidants, Carol accepted Joan's overtures with grace, proving that while she possessed a fiery hatred for cruelty against her loved ones, her heart ultimately had room for forgiveness. Celebrity feuds can take years to thaw out, but sometimes the most satisfying payback happens in a matter of seconds. The Rumpelmeyers' Hostess and the Ice Cream Parlor. Revenge. Long before Carol Burnett was sweeping the Emmy Awards or filling major concert halls, she was a young, struggling performer living hand-to-mouth in New York City during the late 50s. She had no money, no powerful industry connections, and zero fame to protect her. In those early days, the world could be a cold, unwelcoming place for an ambitious woman trying to make it in show business. But even back then, before the world knew her name, Carol harbored an absolute burning hatred for petty authority figures who used their tiny bits of power to publicly humiliate everyday people. That hatred produced one of the most brilliant, satisfying moments of real-life revenge in comedy history. The year was 1959. Carol had just landed a small, life-changing breakthrough role on Broadway in the musical Once Upon a Mattress. After years of surviving on cheap meals and shared apartment rent, she finally had a tiny bit of pocket money to treat herself. To celebrate her new, modest success, she decided to visit Rumpelmeyers, an ultra-exclusive, famous French ice cream parlor and restaurant located inside the St. Moritz Hotel near Central Park. Rumpelmeyers was known across Manhattan for its opulent decor, stuffed animals, high society clientele, and strict, snooty atmosphere. For Carol, walking through those doors felt like stepping into a world of luxury she had only ever dreamed about as a kid. However, Carol had made one major mistake. She was dressed for comfort. Coming off a long, tiring day of rehearsals, she was wearing a pair of simple tailored slacks instead of a formal dress. At the time, high-end New York establishments maintained rigid conservative dress codes, especially regarding women wearing pants. But instead of politely explaining the policy at the door or pulling Carol aside to discreetly inform her of the rule, the head hostess at Rumpelmeyers decided to turn the situation into a cruel public spectacle. The moment Carol walked into the grand dining room, the hostess stormed up to her, blocked her path, and began loudly scolding her in front of a packed room of wealthy upper-crust diners. The hostess sneered, berating Carol at the top of her lungs for daring to enter such a fine establishment wearing trousers. She made sure everyone in the dining room turned around to stare, deliberately trying to make Carol feel small, dirty, and utterly humiliated. For a split second, Carol felt the hot sting of shame. She felt the eyes of dozens of judging strangers burning into her back. She felt the familiar, terrible feeling of being made to feel like she didn't belong. But then, something snapped inside her. The sheer hatred for the hostess's unnecessary cruelty instantly burned away her embarrassment, replacing it with pure, brilliant, comedic adrenaline. Carol realized she had two choices. She could quietly bow her head and slink out the door in tears, or she could use her sharp, quick-thinking improv skills to completely destroy the hostess's social standing in a matter of seconds. Carol chose war. Without missing a beat, Carol let her jaw drop in shock. She let out a soft, pained gasp and stiffened her body. Then, dragging her right leg slightly behind her as if she were in immense physical pain, she looked at the hostess and shouted loudly enough for every single person in the crowded restaurant to hear. "I am so terribly sorry. I didn't know. I have a wooden leg." The reaction in the room was instant and catastrophic for the hostess. The entire dining room gasped in collective horror. Wealthy patrons dropped their spoons, turning their glares away from Carol and directing them straight at the hostess. The room filled with furious murmurs as the diners realized this arrogant staff member had just publicly berated and humiliated a poor, disabled young woman over a pair of pants. The hostess's face turned bright red as her haughty confidence instantly evaporated into pure panic. Terrified of a massive public relations disaster and the wrath of her wealthy customers, the hostess completely changed her tune. Stuttering, sweating, and bowing repeatedly in shame, she began apologizing profusely to Carol. She quickly escorted Carol to one of the best tables in the house, pulled out her chair with extreme care, and catered to her every whim for the rest of the afternoon. Carol sat comfortably at her table, enjoying her grand ice cream sundae in absolute triumph, having turned a moment of public humiliation into a masterclass in swift justice. Carol's legendary ice cream parlor revenge became a story she retold for decades. It perfectly captured the core of who she was, a kind, humble person who truly hated bullies, but possessed the brilliant wit, courage, and iron will required to always get the last laugh. They loved her anyway. Despite the sharp edges Carol Burnett showed when defending her work environment, her co-stars and peers never viewed her as difficult, arrogant, or cold. In fact, they revered her as one of the most generous, supportive, and effective leaders in television entertainment history. The secret to her legendary workplace culture was simple. Carol never let her personal ego run the rehearsal room. Harvey Corman famously noted that even though her name was featured on the marquee, Carol was always the very first star to give away the store, eagerly stepping back into supporting roles so her castmates could steal the spotlight. Tim Conway often praised the way Carol cultivated a creative environment where performers were actively encouraged to take major risks, mess up, and to make hilarious unscripted mistakes live on national broadcast cameras. When a young, completely inexperienced Vicki Lawrence first joined the ensemble, Carol did not treat her as a subordinate or a threat. Instead, she took her under her wing and mentored her like a real family. Guest stars like Jim Nabors quickly became lifelong confidants because of her genuine warmth, remarkable humility, and her thoughtful habit of sending personal handwritten notes of gratitude after every rap. Carol certainly was not without her flaws. She possessed a fierce, uncompromising temper when pushed past her reasonable limits, demanded absolute perfection from her crew, and enforced unyielding boundaries against workplace disrespect. But her cast adored her because her intensity was never about personal vanity. It was always focused on protecting the creative integrity of the team. She proved that a woman could run a massive television empire with complete authority while keeping her heart open and treating everyone with deep, authentic respect. Her legacy remains a masterclass in grace, grit, and leadership. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more classic Hollywood stories. Thanks for watching.